Maybe it's like
your face is part of that.
Let me pin you.
It's like it does not want me. I'm just gonna put it in manual focus
it's almost like it's
mode.
Mm-hmm.
getting your mic instead of you, which is like
Yeah,
close
it's
but not
focusing on
quite
the
there.
mic.
All right, we're live on YouTube.
Live on YouTube.
There we go.
Like, is it a bad idea to go see
Yeah, that
myself on
looks
YouTube?
better.
You should be fine seeing yourself.
You have a link? I've never seen this. This is like the first time.
It's in
I'm
the
seeing
GoTime
this.
FM channel now. I just posted it.
Okay.
I always think it's weird how like you see yourself inverted.
I'm like
Because,
raising my
like-
hand. That's not the hand.
I've never fully understood it because every time it's inverted, it's like not what I want. But I'm
I
like,
think it's
whatever.
because you're so used to seeing yourself in the mirror, and that's the only time you see yourself, that if you see yourself not in a mirror, it confuses your brain a little bit. Because you're like, oh, I'm raising my right hand, but it looks like I'm raising my left hand. Because every time I raise my right hand when I'm looking at myself, it looks like my left hand.
I mean, I'd agree with you, but I also was trying to use tweezers in the mirror the other day, and that wasn't working either because right wasn't right or like forward wasn't forward. I was like, oh, this is not working.
Mirrors were a great invention and also a terrible one at the same time.
Like my brain just did not want to fully grasp it. I'm like, this is just not working for me.
The link that's in our channel. Oh, you mean the GoTime channel, not the GoTime FM channel.
I also feel like before I saw myself recorded, I thought I had a pretty symmetrical face. And then I did the thing where I like swapped between and I was like, whoa, you have a really wonky face.
I've never
It's
even
really-
considered doing that. I don't think I want to.
Well, my sister told me to do it and she thought it was hilarious. So that was how she tricked me into doing it. She's like, Angelica, you have a weird face and I'll prove it. It's like, okay. She's younger, in case you couldn't tell.
Feel
Sounds like something a sibling would say, though.
Well, your
Your
face
face
looks
is
weird.
weird.
Yeah.
it's
That's
like the only person that can get away
lowest-
with it.
That's like the nicest thing on the bar of sibling teasing.
Right. Disable some notifications, bells, whistles. Goodness, it's almost like I haven't done this before. All these things I'm having to relearn.
It's reassuring to us newbies who are still like, I've checked that I'm recording myself about 7 times in the space of a minute.
Are the kilobytes going up?
Yes, they are.
Bars and kilobytes.
Well, I'm only on megabytes at this point.
Well, whatever's fine. As long as there's
Yeah.
something there. If it says 0, we've got a problem.
There is something there. It also says 4 minutes, so I've been recording for 4 minutes.
All right. People are waiting impatiently.
Should we do that sync clap before we forget?
Yeah, we got to do that sync clap.
Do it.
All right. It's
You
going to be
ready?
1, 2, 3, then clap.
Okay.
So you're
Okay,
clapping
clap
on
on
forward.
4. Right.
Okay.
Oh, wait, okay.
1, 2, 3.
Hey.
Hopefully mine was loud enough at my mic. It didn't seem like it on my end, but whatever. Okay, I guess I have to do intros today. I'm like waiting for somebody to do that. Fun times. Is there anything else we need before we go live?
I don't think,
I think so.
All right, cool.
It's going to be a great chat, everyone.
Setting expectations is pretty high there.
Yeah.
Well, these are
That's good.
wonderful people. We could talk about anything and it would be fun, in my opinion.
All right, hello and welcome to Go Time. Today we're talking about different types of writing and whether or not there's anything that can relate to writing code or our day-to-day jobs. So we're joined by 2 new regulars. First is Angelica Hill. Angelica, you want to say hi?
Hi.
And we've got Kris Brandow. Kris, you want to say hi?
Hello.
And then we've got Johnny Boursiquot, who's here all the time. Sorry,
Wow.
Johnny. It's been a
Yeah,
while.
he's like, he's a fixture on the wall
Like
by
I see
now,
Johnny
so-
all the time. It's like a weekly thing.
Right. Yeah, good to be here.
It's good to have you. And I didn't mean to downplay that. You being here is great. All right. So why don't we just start off by Kris, I believe you're the one who really loves writing. You've told us this. So what interests you about writing?
Let's see. Like, for as long as I can remember, I've always been a writer and always like wanted to be a writer. I think like the first time that I tried like writing a book in quotes was like when I was 6. I had like, oh, I just want to like write this and like write a story, and then like showed it to my dad. I'm so proud of myself, and I kind of just like kept writing. It's kind of like a lifeblood for me, I guess. It helps me think. And I actually turned that into a college degree. I went to school for creative writing, specializing in fiction, screenwriting, and playwriting. It's just kind of like always been a staple of my life. So I guess that's the history of me as a writer.
I don't think your teachers would have expected you to translate creative writing to writing Go.
Probably not. And that's also kind of like the other funny thing about my backstory is that I tried to avoid tech, specifically like software and computers as much as possible. Because growing up, my dad's a computer scientist and my mom studied computer science. So all the family gatherings were like, are you going to go into computers like your family, like your mom and your dad? And I was being like, no, I'm going to be an author. I'm going to be a novelist. And then somehow I just wound right back here.
All right. Angelica, I think you are also very excited about this one. So what interests you about writing?
I am. I'm very, very excited about it. I mean, I entered writing via drama and theatre. So I was obsessed with Shakespeare, as probably mostly everyone who has ever met me knows. So I fell in love with the way that writing could bring people's stories to life, could put emotions, feelings, experiences that some people might find really difficult to express, were it not if they didn't have that medium to just sit, write, rewrite, think it through, and really get to a place where they're presenting what they want to present to the world in a way that is true to them and their story. So I started by just loving acting and bringing those words to life, and then kind of went backwards and realized I didn't really want to do acting, and I preferred writing. So similar to Kris, I went to university for English literature and drama, dabbled in playwriting, wasn't all that good, and now I just write for fun, both code and poetry. Mostly.
I feel like people are going to think they're on the wrong podcast today. Johnny, anything about writing that's really interesting to you, or really gets you or has you appealing to this episode?
Oh yeah. For me, I discovered early on, not even in my career, earlier on in my I would say high school career, that writing was about storytelling, right? Writing was about sort of I mean, imagine you're a kid in high school and you know who finds writing to be sort of a way of communicating and doing so in a much more sort of doing so more easily than they can, like with words in real life, right? So that was kind of my discovery, is that I with the right tools, right, with the right sort of a continuous study and picking up, you know, good vocabulary and learning new words and trying to pick up, you know, like a new word and using that in a sentence, kind of, you know, every day or something like that. Like I earlier on, I was lucky enough, and I don't know where that came from. Maybe it was a teacher. You know, if that's the case, I'm grateful wherever they are in the universe now. You know, it quickly became clear to me that in order to communicate with the world, whether you're present or not, like you have that ability to basically take a thought and convert that into words and somehow still try to capture what you would have sort of conveyed were you know speaking to someone else or a group of people sort of you know face to face. Like trying to do that for me has always been sort of the like something I'm always chasing, because again, the power of storytelling, right? So in fast forward through the rest of my career, that still remains true, probably even more so today than before. Like the ability to convey information, right, and somehow like put a part of yourself in that communication, and for someone else to consume, you know, tomorrow or, you know, 10 years from now. There's something just really romantic about that. It's something that really is that sort of I gravitate towards that a little bit. And writing is in everywhere in our lives, right? Whether we realize it or not, especially because we are in the industry we are right now. And if you're tuning in now, yes, this is a Go podcast. We are talking about sort of the effects of writing, but I think, you know, writing, whether it be for communicating with coworkers or managers or other people, you know, within your broader community, or writing code, I think, which we're going to get into, there's an aspect of writing that touches on everything, right? Whether you're actually creating things for publication and print, or whether you actually have to write down, a story before you can tell it on stage, or whether you have to, write a course, whatever the case may be, writing is a through line across all of that.
So I guess I'm the outlier here because I always thought I hated writing. And I don't think I actually hated writing. I think I just had experiences I didn't care for, where learning it in school, it always felt very subjective. And it felt like the way I would take things or I try to express things or whatever didn't seem to translate directly as to what the teacher wanted. So it was always frustrating when I wasn't doing well in classes, or not necessarily terribly, but it never felt like it was for me. But then over time, I've definitely learned that when you get into tech, being able to write and explain things clearly, like Johnny said, is incredibly valuable. Even now, especially with us all being remote, but I've been remote since well before the pandemic, and learning how valuable writing can be for communicating things that you aren't there to answer questions for has sort of opened me up to liking writing more. But I'll definitely say that in the past, I was always just like, no, I don't like writing. It's not for me.
I would say though, and I'm sure we'll get into this. I know Kris has a lot to say on this. Like, you write code. Like, when we're talking about writing, we're not just talking about like writing literature, writing poems, writing a message to your colleague on Slack. We're talking about physically the code that you write every day. That's writing. And it is a way, as a form of communication. Like, you're not, and we've touched on this before, with Kris in our previous conversation, like, you're writing code predominantly for your other engineers. Like, you go in and they read your work and they edit it, and they, as kind of Johnny had touched on, you're writing it, and maybe like 3 years down the line, someone else needs to come, a human being needs to come to your code, read it, and be able to understand and process it. I don't know whether, Kris, you want to say more on that.
Yeah. I think that kind of sums up and describes really well the conjecture I have that software engineering is a writing discipline. Like, I got a degree in the disciplines of playwriting and screenwriting and fiction, and, software engineering and programming sits right next to that. I think people kind of tilt their head a little bit sometimes when I say that, oh, I have a creative writing degree, and they're like, and sometimes people say like, oh, it's like sad that you're not using your creative writing degree or using your degree in your career. It's like, no, actually, like, the skills that I learned in college taking my creative writing courses are invaluable and have made me such a better software engineer because I went through those courses, because I learned those things.
Yeah. You're creatively solving problems by writing code.
Yeah. And, the actual language looks different, but, screenwriting and playwriting are surprisingly very different things, even though they're conceptually similar. And I think that's kind of like the same kind of thing where, like, okay, code, it looks quite different, but it falls in line with the rest of the things that you can express and the rest of the disciplines that fall within writing.
I mean, even within within any language community, especially, I'll speak for the ones I'm familiar with, especially within the Ruby community, for example. One of the things the Rubyists will tell you is that, the expressiveness of the language, right? When you're writing it, and later on when you have to read it, because we all know we read code a heck of a lot more than we write it. The ability to sort of read, right, and for what you're reading, at least, in the English language, for what you're reading to make sense, as if you're reading prose, right? Basically, you're seeking to convey clarity, right? So the more expressive the language, the more words you can use to express the intent, right? The more it feels like, like prose, the more it feels like you have more tools at your disposal to convey, intent, right? Something which is very hard. This is what we do all day, every day, whether it be naming rules or spacing to guide the eyes. I mean, all these things play a role. And like, once you realize there's a connection between the skill of conveying intent, in your code, that is, it's not just knowing some esoteric, things about the language. Really, you're trying to convey intent in as simple a way as possible, right? Regardless of the language you're using, right? That's always the intent. Once you realize that connection there, right, you become a much better programmer. You become a much better technologist, because really what we're doing, all we are as engineers are sort of that middle tier, right, between what the business wants, right, and the technology. They can't speak that language directly, okay, and believe me, they try. I mean, if you have to, I mean, all you have to do is just look at technology out there to see, you know, all these sort of a drag and drop, you know, tools and interfaces. Even Amazon came out with, you know, yet another one, you know, back at reInvent a couple months ago. You know, like there's this pursuit within our industry to obviate, to make the need for folks like us who write code, right, to make us less important, less relevant, because we can be a bottleneck, right? So if you can somehow reduce that and allow basically the people with the intent and the know-how, exactly what they want, right, from a business standpoint, to actually implementing the actual execution part, right? If they could do away with us, they absolutely would. Make no mistake about it. They absolutely would get rid of us, right? But we are that translation layer, right? So now we have to write for the rest of us who are, you know, working together to basically, you know, to take the intent, and now we have to, there's another layer of that, say, hey, like now I'm writing for my fellow engineers, now I need to convey intent to them, right? But still the ultimate goal is to take, you know, some desire, right, by people paying our salaries, right, and to convert into technology. So there's a lot here about understanding and intent and communication, right, at all layers of the stack, if you will, right, and knowing how to write, whether it be to communicate with, you know, the lay folks who are not, you know, engineers and writing code, or whether it be, you know, us talking to each other. It's all about how well can you relay intent through writing.
And I think an interesting point on that too is how that compares to what some of the other writing disciplines look like, and the respect for the writer within those disciplines. Like another interesting thing of difference between screenwriting and playwriting is how much the writer is, I wouldn't say respected, but how big a role they play. In playwriting, like when you put on a stage play, you try and stick to the writer's intent as much as possible. The playwright is sacred. But in screenwriting and in movies, like the screenwriter is just like, oh, someone that happened to produce this story. But it's like the director that we really care about that kind of shapes that narrative. And I think too, on your point of like necessity of the writers, I think another interesting point of contrast there would be with kind of like the publishing industry and like books and novels. Like often a lot of people that write books are not, you know, professional writers, and they're just, you know, putting together a story because they have the knowledge to tell that story. And you have editors that come in, and those editors help refine and create like a more polished story for the end consumers. And I think there's some interesting things you can pull from those other disciplines into our own to make building and writing software like a bit more coherent.
I think it's
May
also
or may not be. Oh, sorry, go for it.
I was just going to say that it's interesting to me that you mentioned that some people would think you don't apply writing to code, and then it's not that hard to realize, or doesn't take that many steps to sort of realize that people have sort of caught on to that connection and even experimented with it. So when you see testing frameworks like Cucumber, where you're literally writing paragraphs to design a test, you know, people have gone as far as experimenting with it. So it is like writing code is definitely different than writing a play in many ways. But it's also interesting that people have come to the point where they can actually write tests in a very similar way to how you would write a story.
Yeah, and I think that brings up like another thing I've spent some time thinking about, which is kind of the comparison of software engineering is like writing versus software engineering is writing. I kind of feel like the using prose to write your test is more toward the, okay, like this is a good way to understand things, so we're just going to borrow this from, I guess you could probably say like fiction or novel writing or that kind of structure of writing, and try and apply it to software engineering, which I think is a good first step, right? It does make test easier to consume, but it is like awkward because you're applying an analogy on top of software engineering, which is kind of like any other type of analogy. Now there's some like software engineering is like gardening or like construction or like something, and it fits well at first, and then you start to see the places where it doesn't quite meet. And I think the next step we kind of need to make is like, okay, like they have some nice things in these other disciplines of writing. How can we take that and bring it into software engineering and adjust it to like make it so that we can write tests that are easy to read and are pleasant to read, but don't necessarily come with the baggage that comes from like, say, the looseness of trying to write things with prose and paragraphs.
So are there any specifics that you would like sort of want to focus on first? I guess like the first thing for me, at least, that comes to mind is when you're learning how to write persuasive papers, you always like have to start with a hypothesis of some sort that you're trying to prove. So like, is that something that could apply to maybe tests or something along those lines? Or, you know, where would you, I guess, what connections are you seeing?
I feel like one of the biggest connections we could probably pull is the kind of process and format that most other writing disciplines go through when they want to produce something. Like, I feel like when we write code, we always want to jump into writing the code, right? That's the first thing we're like, oh, we want to start writing, but is whether it's like by writing the test or whether it's by like writing a prototype and hacking it together. That's like the first thing we want to do. And in most other writing disciplines, that's not what you do, right? If you want to write a book, you don't sit down and write chapter 1 and start writing your story. And the same thing's true. You don't write the opening scene for your screenplay when you sit down and write it. You have these other documents, whether that's an outline or a treatment in screenwriting, or character bios, right? You have all of these other documents and all those other forms of information that you kind of play and experiment with a story before you actually lay it down in its final form. And I think that's something that we kind of desperately need to start doing in software engineering. Like, so many of the projects I've been involved in and some of the companies I've worked at have like a little bit of a culture of writing like scope and design docs, but it's definitely not very robust. And I think what that ultimately leads to is kind of the result that you'd wind up with if you just sat down one day and started writing a book and tried to kind of write it all the way through, instead of like sitting down and kind of planning it out some more. And I think that's, I think what's important to note there too is that it is contained within the software engineering sphere. Like, I think there are other people that do other type of planning and documents, right? Whether it's product people or business people, and those need to be done. But I think those are kind of separate from what software engineers need to do to kind of produce those pre-code documents.
We have, I think we do try to do that. We're just not consistent about it, right? So
yeah,
over the years, I've heard all kinds of, you know, tooling and mnemonics and things that we sort of try to introduce into our workflow as engineers, right? Before we jump to the code, and you have folks that are sort of on the extremes of that. You know, you have the folks that are like, let's just start writing the code and we'll figure it out as we go, because, you know, working code is better than, you know whatever the thing is, right? I mean, they have a point to a point, right? But and then you have those on the other side who are basically, you know, they get stuck in the analysis, right? The analysis paralysis stuff. They spend all their times, you know, in drawing tools, you know, creating boxes and arrows, and never actually execute anything, right? I think the ideal, really, like most things in life, is to not be on the extremes of things, right? Is to really find the middle ground, right? That allows you to make progress, you know, still while having a plan, right? And then seeing, you know, you make an incremental change. The same thing we preach, you know, in our you know, engineers, basically, that immediate feedback loop, or that short feedback loop. Basically, you make a change and see what's broken, and you go back to, you know, you make an adjustment again, and then, you know, you make more progress. And then, so that feedback loop, basically, you don't have to sort of jump right into writing the code. You write the code when you know what you're building. Sometimes you don't know what you're building yet, right? So I don't subscribe to the let's just jump into the code and figure it out thing, which is why personally one of the tools I use right off the bat is basically, if I can use either README driven development, or jumping into something like Lucidchart or Draw.io, whatever it is, right? Just to get an idea of what's going on. Another tool I use is websitediagrams.com. I've been using that for years to create sequence diagrams, right? How do things interact? How do components within the system interact with each other? So a lot of times I will discover that what I'm missing when I go through that exercise, right? Like, if you take nothing from what I'm saying right now, sequence diagrams, they are your best friend. Trust me on this, right? Because it will force you to think, okay, what's the entry point into this thing that I'm building, right? Where is it coming from? What is the shape of the data, right? What do I need here, right? When I get to this point, what is the other thing that so it's almost like you're weaving a story, you're making a plot, right? you're coming up, you really it is storytelling if you squint, right? It is storytelling, because you mean who are the cast, who's the cast in this story, right? This execution of a business process, whatever it is, right? Who are the actors, who's involved, what's the setting, right? What does the stage look like, what's the environment, right? Or if somebody, this is best case scenario, right? This actor says this one replies that, this. So if you see the world as that, the world that you're in as that stage, and you can script things, right? You can then account for, okay, well, if this doesn't happen, this actor then has to do this, and like also like you're adding improv into the whole mix, right? So now you're like, then that allows you to see a much bigger. So again, not taking that to an extreme whereby you're trying to think of all contingencies and things like that, but starting out, right, with some high level view of this is what my desired end goal, right? And these are the actors that are a part of these ecosystem, that are part of this play that I'm trying to put together, right? And seeing what's the interaction back and forth between them, right? That will help you uncover a ton of problems up front, right? Again, you will have basically, even if it's a back of napkin drawing, right, of what it is you need to account for, right? That puts you in a way better position, right? So some planning up front, right, does wonders, right? And it's the same, again, it's a technique that you can learn from the writing world. You can bring that into your engineering practice, and it works wonders.
And I think an important thing on that too is like, this is like a very new thing, I think, in software engineering in general. I mean, software engineering is a very young field as it is. So I think it's important to like explore and find the tools and continue to try and find the tools that work for for this process, for this way of creating software. Because I think sometimes we get, we start doing something and then the whole industry kind of converges and it becomes like best practice, and like that's what everybody does. And it's like, it hasn't had enough time to like actually become a best practice. Like, we've been doing it for 2 years. There's no way that this thing is a best practice. We haven't written enough software with it. So I think it's important to, like, whether it's diagrams or whether it's prose writing or whether it's actively like rapid prototyping, whatever it is that you use to like kind of explore the space and establish what it is you're going to create, we need to like really try and explore the edges of that before we even begin to think about like settling down. And I think a big part of it, that exploration, is also documenting how we're doing these sorts of explorations. So I think that oftentimes we don't document that process because it's hard to kind of stop and be disciplined about writing down what you're doing when you're in this frenzy of coming up with like good ideas and being all excited about everything. And it seems difficult to distill that down into something that's generally useful for people. But I think also, at this point in time, we don't need it to be generalized. Like, just write down what you're doing, write down what you're thinking, write down the process that you're using, and we'll generalize it later. But I do think that's like super important, not to like cut off or constrain how we go about this kind of design and planning process for our software too early.
I found that if you also tell yourself like what mode you're in, right, you're giving yourself the permission, right, to ideate, if that's the stage of the design that you're in. Or if you say, okay, right now I'm in spike mode, I don't know what I don't know. Doing TDD wouldn't really help me much, because really you do TDD when you kind of know what it is that you want to build, what it is that you're trying to get, right? That's when TDD is useful, not when you have zero clue what you're building. So depending on what mode you're in, right? Am I in information gathering? Do I need to go read a few Wikipedia articles to know, what a particular topic or theory is, right? It's okay to jot down notes. It's okay to not be organized. It's okay to just be free flowing with ideas as they come, because and that's the mode you're in, right? Once you've done enough information gathering, which shouldn't last, too long, however how long that is, I don't know, that's going to depend on a case-by-case basis. But the idea is to have enough to have a certain degree, a certain level of confidence that given the objective, that you kind of have a general idea of what direction you need to go. You have a general idea of what it is that needs to be part of your solution, right? And then you refine from there. But give yourself permission, right, to explore. Give yourself permission to think, right, as opposed to jumping into code and then trying to do the thinking as you're trying to do the execution, right? It's you know, it's not ready, fire, aim, right?
Do you think some of this is made worse by the fact that when we're first learning to code, whether it's university or whatever, a vast majority of the things we do are on an individual basis, and then we get thrown into this, basically a company, a team, whatever, where we have to work with others, and processes that sort of worked on our own start to fall apart because we need to be communicating with other people? I guess an example I can think of is like an author who's writing one novel can probably get away with whatever process works for them. But if you have like a whole team writing TV shows or something, that's very unlikely to work. You can't just have one person keeping everything in their head. The whole team has to sort of communicate on character development and things like that.
This is actually something that I've been thinking about recently, because I saw a thread on Twitter where someone gave like a really good explanation of what I think it was stemmed off continuous integration, but like what, you know, extreme programming and pair programming and all of that, like what was the genesis of that and how it was more about synchronous team-based software engineering versus what we're more used to, which is the asynchronous individual-based software engineering. And I think a lot of the time when we think about writing disciplines, we think of that kind of asynchronous individual based, right? If you talk about novel writing, most novels are written that way. Screenplays, plays, most of those things are written that way. Sometimes you'll have a couple of people, but as you pointed out, TV shows are absolutely not written that way. TV shows have a writer's room and everybody is in that room and everybody is working together. And those are two extremely different methods of writing. And you can't really take the techniques of, say, the individual way you write a novel and just pull them over to a writer's room. That won't work. And that's sort of the situation that we're in right now as an industry, where we, you know, everybody was excited and talking about this kind of writer's room style of doing software engineering. And we just started plucking the tiny little things that we saw. We're like, oh, that sounds nice. That looks nice. Like, oh yeah, we can like sort of do pair programming, and we can like sort of do test-driven development. We can sort of do continuous integration. I think continuous integration is like a really interesting point here too, because it's like, we've taken the term continuous integration and left what it means, right? It's like continually integrating. That means you're literally like continually putting all of the code together, which implies you don't have gates where you have to like stop and check. It's like the code goes in and you can check it afterward, which ironically is like some of the ways that like novels are written, right? Like you put it into form and then you send it to the editor. You don't say, oh, can I add this paragraph here before the editor allows you to put it in? But like we've taken these terms and then we've just tried to put them into a different domain. And I think what would help here is if we recognize that and separated them. So we understand, okay, these are the techniques you use if you're going to do an asynchronous individual focused software development process. And these are the tools that you use for a synchronous team-based development process, and have a good understanding of that and not try to commingle the two.
I assume that some of those could be not commingled in the way that you're referring to, but like if you're building one small part of a project and like it's sort of siloed off as like, you know, John's going to build this one specific piece, you can kind of in your head at that point use a little bit of that, I guess. But then the hard part's communicating that to your team later, which I don't know if that would end up causing more problems than just sticking with the, you know, the writing room style where you have a whole team the whole time.
I think the writing room style is definitely a bit more difficult, I think. I mean, it's extremely difficult now because, you know, pandemic, we can't all be in the same room together. We can't all be like working in close quarters with a large group of people. But I do think like the techniques are adaptable to asynchronous style programming, but you have to be much more disciplined about them. I think, you know, the continuous integration example, once again, is like a really good one, because like if you have continuous integration, then you have to trust that an individual, and you want to apply it to like individual based development, you have to trust that an individual will not be able to put things into the code base that will cause catastrophic problems, which means that your testing infrastructure needs to be really good. Everybody needs to understand the style of the code base. You probably need to do larger periodic reviews of your code base to make sure that the style hasn't crept in a way you don't want it to. And I think the problem is that, unlike with the synchronous method, where if you don't have these things, right, if you don't have a good testing framework, it will be extremely painful. In the asynchronous method, we just kind of deal with it, right? Like if the tests take a long time to run, we resolve that by like running the tests less often. Or if the tests aren't as solid as we'd like them to be, we kind of just get away with that by having more code review or spending more time on code reviews. So I think there's a lot of good things we can pull from the synchronous style into the asynchronous style. But I think kind of back to your original point, I think there are some times when we really do want to break up software and build up building software into pieces where like individuals can just go off and write things on their own, because at a point, you know, you can't have a writer's room with 200 people. That's too much. So at a point, you have to start breaking it up if you want to kind of produce these larger and larger things. And I think we just have to kind of navigate and explore that space in a way we haven't yet. And I think base level involves just a lot more discipline around understanding that the synchronous things, or the things from the synchronous style, are really adaptable and really good to have. Like, I don't think anyone would say, I don't want to have a robust set of tests for my software. Like, of course you do. And I think the thing is to like actually build in those habits to our processes to make sure that we are doing and adhering to them, and we're not letting that slip because we can.
And I would say it is very much kind of outside of just the engineers and the team. It needs to be a team-wide process, discussion, conversation. So like, I'm a product manager, and like a big part of setting up this kind of process is the product, the project, the engineer managers, all the engineers getting together and deciding, okay, this is our release schedule. Okay, this is how we're going to chunk out work. Okay, so if you're working on a spike, are you also going to do the proof of concept? How are we going to allow the rest of the team to have input on that? Are we going to have a demo? Are we going to have everyone kind of come together and decide who's pair programming and what? I think it's really on a project by project, but also a team by team basis, because a lot of the conversations I'm having with my engineers when we're thinking about huge projects we're building out are, okay, is this something that you feel like you can just go away and do by yourself? Is the rest of the team okay with you going off, doing a proof of concept and coming back? Or do we want to have a working session where we all brainstorm all the different proof of concepts we could do, and we all come together and then we go into development? So I agree. It's kind of very much with Kris, in that we're in a place where we really need to be open to just trying stuff out, experimenting, seeing what kind of projects are able to be split up and what projects really do need to be more organized and much more held close to the whole team being involved. But I would say this is not just on engineering, like everyone in your team needs to be bought into this, because if the engineers are working in one way and then you have like a project manager or a product manager come in and be like, no, like, what are you doing? Then that can just throw a wrench in the beautiful processes you're trying out.
I have a theory.
Oh, go for it.
You have a theory?
I have a theory. Yeah. And it is based on sort of lived experience, right? I think in large organizations where the time from idea, right, as communicated by the product team or the leadership or whatever, what have you, the time from idea, right, coming down, and your team haven't been sort of designated as owning a piece of that, right, to bring it to fruition. The time from idea to actual execution is so long, right? The bigger you are, the more levels exist between that idea and, you know, the people doing the execution in terms of the coding. The more those layers, the more the engineer, as soon as they hear anything, right, about, they get a general idea, a general sense of what needs to be done, they know by the time all the dust settles, they're gonna be waiting for so long. So I think there's a sort of this sort of an impetus that as soon as I get some degree of clarity, right, I want to start jumping into the code, because I don't know when, you know, this thing's gonna change. Is the carpet gonna be pulled under me while I'm doing this? Like, there's this desire that, you know, and when you work in very large organizations, you want to contribute, you want to be effective, right? So, which is very different from when you're in a startup environment or a smaller organization. You know, you might have a handful of colleagues, where the distance between idea, right, to you know, doing a spike and experimenting and doing R&D, doing a prototype, whatever it is, that there's so much less sort of, you know, bureaucracy and layers between those two things, that this is the point where you do need to spend a bit more time, right, thinking about what needs to be done, because you can just hear something in a hallway, right, and be at your desk cranking out code the very same day, right, just to get something working. And perhaps in some environments that is exactly what you need to do, if your survival depends on how fast can you ship features, today and whatnot. But so I think what we're saying here makes sense, but some of it is going to make more sense depending on where you are in your career, where you are and within the organization in which you work. So it's not one broad brush, saying, hey, we should all do it this way. I think there are lots of lessons here, right, across the board, right. Some of it's going to apply more if you are in a small team with fewer layers, right, and some of it's not going to work out so well if you're in a much larger team with a lot more layers between you and those ideas. So again, lots of ideas. You kind of have to what you need as an engineer, what you need to know, right, your maturity comes in the ability to discern which environment am I in, which one of these tools is applicable in this environment, right. That's what machines can't do for you. That's that insight, that gut feeling, or that maturity that comes with doing the work, working with other people, communicating with other people, the writings that you get, the writings that you do need to send back up, like all these things. These are the things that play a role into your ability, right, to be effective in those environments, knowing which environment you're in. And that's something that time is gonna help you get better at. Unfortunately, there's no quick way to acquire that knowledge, but over time you should be focusing on basically asking yourself, right, every time you get a promotion or every year or whatever the cadence you want to pick, is how well am I able to sort of discern, right, from business to execution, how effective can I be within this environment. And by where effectiveness is not judged by how quickly can I get to writing code, right, is how quickly can I actually take the intent, right, and do something with it.
Yeah, I think that brings up an interesting thought in my head of how, like, we as an industry compare ourselves to like construction a lot, which I think is like not a good comparison. We're not really anything like it. But I think an apt analogy or metaphor here would be like, if you're gonna build like a small like shed or something, like a small building, you can more or less like hop into it. You don't have to do a lot of planning. But if you're gonna go build a skyscraper, you need to do like a lot more planning, and there's a lot more people involved, a lot more logistics. So the way that you build those two different kinds of buildings looks extremely different. And I feel like we as an industry kind of don't like that, and we just want to have like, here's the one way that you build software that's applicable to like building a shed and building a skyscraper, right? It's like, no, those are two very different types of things, and like the tools you use for one are obviously very different from the tools you use for the other, and what would be appropriate for one is not appropriate for the other. So I think, to your point, Johnny, we have to like do a lot more. I think not just people learning this as they go, but us as an industry taking more of a conscious effort to sit down and say, all right, like, figure out the scale of the type of software that you're trying to build, and then we can tell you and help you with what tools that you should be using.
So we've talked a lot about the prepping phase, like, sort of getting up to how we can be better at planning for when we're building something. Are there parts of writing that you think apply to the actual like process of writing code, and like once you're actually into the writing phase?
Absolutely. So I think I think this is kind of like a combined, like, as you're writing and then as you're maintaining the code that you've written. A really good thing that we could borrow from other disciplines is this idea of like a manual of style, where it's more about guiding people so that we all kind of stay in the same area, instead of like giving people specific rules. That was like a really messy explanation. So that's what I'm trying to say is, like, I think one of the things that we can borrow from writing into software engineering is this idea of like kind of doing continual comprehensive reviews of our code as we're going, to make sure that it's all in sync and all makes sense. I gave a talk at GopherCon a couple of years ago that hit on this point a little bit. where we're like really good at like the copy editing level of kind of reviewing code, right? We can find your syntactical problems or your like misuse of APIs or like some bugs that you've written, but they're very localized usually to like, okay, this specific thing that I'm reviewing for your code. And it's really hard, especially with our tooling, to go review like, oh, I know that we have this thing, but it's like similar in this other part of the code base. So if we're going to change it here, we have to change it over here as well. And as code bases get larger, that becomes harder and harder to do. And I think that's the role that style guides play, or manuals of style play, is in helping you catch those sorts of shifts and changes in your code base as you go. And I think the size of your manual style shifts as your code base or as the collection of code bases you have grows. Like I think when you start, you have a very small manual style because like you don't have much code. And then as you get more and more and more code, you add more and more and more to it. And the purview of what you're adding shifts as well. Like for instance, like the Chicago manual style, I think is like 1,000 pages. But it started out as literally just a bunch of style sheets for the University of Chicago Press for the books that they were writing. And they're like, hey, these are pretty similar. So let's take them and compile them together and then have some general rules of writing. And basically every publisher has a manual of style, which is like when you go pick up a book from like O'Reilly or from No Starch Press, the books all look the same. They have the same feel. They're written in the same sort of way, even though the authors are always different. And that comes out of the manual of style and the editorial process. And I think that's something that we should definitely borrow into software engineering, so that when you see a code base that you're working on, you're like, oh, this group of people wrote this code base. Like you shouldn't be able to say, like, well, Angelica wrote this part of the code base and Jon wrote this other part of the code base. And I can definitely tell because things are so different in their styles. Like that, you shouldn't be able to hear individual people's voices when you're like reading that code.
If I may, there's, I think in the Go community or the Go programming language more specifically, it is I think it is harder to see sort of individual styles come through, because I think that's one of the, and that was a desired effect, right, of the origins of the language, right, that it all sort of flowed similarly, and which is one of the things that, heck, even I sort of, when I'm advocating, for the use of Go, I'm like, hey, like you can go and take a look at any Go project out on GitHub and it'll be readable to you, right? You may not know exactly what's going on, in terms of the domain, for that the solution is, is what problem is trying to solve, but you will be able to read that Go code, right? That's not true for every language, right? I've seen, again, because I'm familiar with Ruby and most recently prior to Go, I could definitely tell, right, when which coworker wrote what part of the code base, what did their imprint on there, right? So and there's nothing wrong with that per se, but again, if we take where we run into trouble is if we try to associate ourselves too much with our tools, right? So to use the analogy used about the publishers and their style guides, right? If somebody hears that, okay, you're gonna be contributing to this book, you're gonna be writing this book or be a contributing author or whatever it is, and but your voice is really not gonna come through that much because we follow this style guide, you're probably gonna feel a little less enthused, right, about writing, because we want that to be an experience. You want somebody to experience you through the pages, and perhaps and again, because when I read those books, I do feel that the style is consistent, and that may be of the nature of technical manuals and technical things. That's obviously certainly not true for novels or like sci-fi stories or what have you, right? You're definitely gonna get a feel for, okay, this particular author, I like the way they write, right? So you can kind of, that's something you want, right? But if we remove ourselves from what we are hired to do, right? If we decouple ourselves from our tooling, right? Like I do want like I'm there to solve a problem, not to necessarily write code, right? So my individuality, my traits as a person, I don't really care. I want to enjoy writing the code, but I don't really care to, that somebody can look at the piece of code and says, yes, that's Johnny's code. That doesn't matter to me as much, right? Because, or it shouldn't, I should say. And again, I'm speaking for myself here. So I think in the Go language, there's less opportunity for your own sort of. Obviously, there's going to be, you can see, you can understand the difference between code written by, somebody who's a veteran versus somebody who's a junior, right? I think that's true of every language. But beyond that, given similarly experienced engineers, the fact that I can't quite tell, right, without doing a git blame, without the fact that I can't quite tell who wrote that code, I think is a feature, right, not a bug, right? So I think you should find ways to express yourself and demonstrate your individuality through perhaps your writing, how you communicate, right, with other folks on your team, right? I think there's a way more opportunity for that, right? Whether it be written or verbal or however, Slack, whatever, short messages, I think these are the places where you have a greater, opportunity to communicate and do so quite well, as opposed to trying to do so in your code.
So I think I probably explained what I was saying wrong. I think voice was probably the wrong word to use there. So what I guess the thing that I'm kind of aiming at is less so like I think for most experienced Go engineers, we do write Go in like this very similar way, even if we're expressing very different things. And I think there is some space for self-expression within those bounds. But I think we're all kind of familiar with this Go was written by a Java programmer, or this Go was written by a C++ programmer, or like this Go is written, like that sort of thing is less about like the expressiveness and the voice of the individual person, and more like trying to borrow idioms where they don't really fit into the language, right? We have a language, we have our own idioms, which result in a specific type of style that you can see. Like when you sit down and you read Go code that was written by an experienced Go engineer, it does have that certain feel that you're talking about, Johnny. But if you kind of just pick up Go code that might be written by someone who isn't as experienced, then it doesn't have that same feel. And I think what style guides and manual style can help us do is really help people that don't have that experience and don't understand the idioms as well, understand them so that they can more quickly write Go code that has that kind of that has that feel and that style of the Go code that we all love.
So to put this into a concrete example, the thing that keeps sticking out in my head is you often hear people talking about keeping the happy path on the left, and everything else sort of gets indented as you go through code. But there's nothing that forces you to do that with Go. I think that's just something that all of us, as we get more experience, realize that having that style consistent is really useful. So we all just sort of do it. So I assume, Kris, that's what you mean when you're talking about style guides, is things like that aren't explicitly necessary, but can be really helpful when you're jumping through the code to sort of always know that it's going to be in that same style.
Yeah, I think that's exactly a good example of something that would go in a manual style. And I think we have that, right? In code review comments, that's one of the things of like, you outdent the success path. But I think sometimes we just need a little bit more nuance to add to there to help people kind of understand why. Like I've gone through this process with a lot of my coworkers where I'm like, oh, like we don't need to use an if else here. We should rearrange the code so the success path is like not indented. And when I explain to them, they're like, oh, okay, now like I understand that. I get that now. And I think that's kind of what the purpose of a lot of manuals of style tend to be. Like as you get more familiar with the manual, you have to refer to it less, and it just becomes something that you like understand. And then sometimes you understand how you should break the rules of the manual and where it's appropriate to break them and where it's not appropriate to break them, which I think is a general thing that comes with rules, right? You're not really allowed to break the rules until you understand them. And I think like that could be helpful, but I think that's like the missing gap right now when it comes to like really having code bases that a wealth of people can kind of contribute to. Because I think it's still pretty hard to hire experienced Go engineers. We're a very popular language, and I think it takes like a number of years of writing Go full time, and especially writing Go around other experienced Go engineers full time before you can really kind of write with that style. Because I also have known people that have written Go code for a long time, but they've written it surrounded by a bunch of people that are writing Java Go. And so their style just becomes Java Go, and they're not kind of incorporating and feeling that same level of, the Go style.
Is our idioms or the idioms that we value so much, right? When we talk about idiomatic Go, for the longest time, and I think still to this day, there's a strong sort of if you're a newbie to the Go community, it won't be long before you hear about, oh, this is not idiomatic Go that you're writing right now, right? Or how have you done that? You're writing Gava or Gooby or whatever, right? So there's this sort of there's this hill that you have to sort of climb. In addition to learning the language, as a newbie, you now also have to learn the way that the people that are in this community want you to write, in the language, right? So there's like two barriers there that you have to surmount. And in his an article, Dave Cheney, who wrote The Zen of Go. We actually had Dave on the show to talk about the Zen of Go. I think this was a talk either at GopherCon or another conference, but he also, as he usually tends to do, basically wrote it out as well as an essay. And he talked about sort of that very problem that we create this sort of artificial barrier, right? That perhaps those of us who have been doing Go for a long time don't realize is a barrier, right? That we put in front of people that are learning the language, and thereby might actually end up having a negative effect, right? And the adoption of the language by those people, because if they see us as being a bunch of snobby, elitist people who want, the language to be used in a certain way and to be written in a particular way, whether it compiles or not, right? Basically eschewing the technicalities of it, then that can be a turnoff for some, right? And I, if it won't be long if you go, search through the Reddits and things like that to sort of get that sense that some folks didn't really like that very specific, regardless of the language itself, that very specific aspect of the Go community, because we just sounded kind of elitist in our way of saying that, hey, you should be writing Go this way. Now, as somebody who's been doing Go for a while, the value of idiomatic Go for me is, again, that I can go on another code base that has been written by longtime Go developers who have been writing Go in the idiomatic way, and that helps me with reading that code and understand what's going on a heck of a lot faster than I would otherwise. So that's the value, okay? So again, detaching the tool, right, and the end goal, all right, we should all write idiomatic Go code, right? Idioms are a thing that communities sort of develop naturally, right, for communication purposes. It makes communication a bit frictionless, right? Because everybody kind of knows, when you use slang term, my teenager so uses some slang terms that I have to go look up sometimes. I'm like, I'll try to keep up with the times, so it's like, in order to, when they're talking, in order for me to sort of keep up, right, with what they're saying, I have to, also go out there and learn, right? I have to keep learning. So my point here is that the idioms are a tool, right, for us to communicate better. That same tool can have a negative side to it, right, if we use it as a barrier, right, for those that are basically trying to adopt the language. What we can do as those who are already in the community that find value in the idioms is to, outstretch a hand and says, hey, yes, I know, you're getting flack for not writing it in the idiomatic way, quote unquote. But here's what would make it, right, more idiomatic, right? Yes, I know you want to ignore your errors here, but we don't like to do that within the Go community, right? We want you to handle your errors. I know it might be a little verbose, but this is the reason why, right? So again, these are opportunities, right, to help somebody out, right, who's coming from a different language, or perhaps goes their first language. They have really no idea, like they're just following, going with the flow here, right? It's an opportunity for us, right, who are already part of the community, to make it more welcoming, right, by sort of helping to remove those barriers, or at least when those mistakes are made, quote unquote, when you see that, right, to not pounce on that individual, but really say, hey, your solution works. It compiles great. That's good. Like, you're learning. When you're learning, it's not about making your code perfect. It's about making it work. Now that you've got it to work, this is how you can make it more idiomatic, more like what you're going to see out there in the Go community, because of the value that we ascribe to that thing. And here's the why, not just because we think we're cool, but here's the why, right? So again, the tools and how you use them make a huge difference.
I think a style guide that explained exactly why would be hugely valuable. As a newbie, I have had multiple people tell me that my Go code is not the way that Go should be written. And that is my first question. I'm like, why? Like, I need to know why. Like, I Google around, I'm like, is there a Go best practices style guide I can go to? And I have wonderful, helpful people who direct me to good Go that I can just read through and look, but there's no concrete place where I'm like, okay, this is the good Go style guide, as Kris referred to it, that I can kind of follow and see where I can take liberties and kind of structure it differently, and what I can't, and what I need to kind of learn and stick to as someone trying to learn the language.
And I think on that as well, I think part of maybe it's like the marketing of Go that we've kind of bungled a bit here. But I think there's this kind of way that we sell it where it's like, oh, the syntax is so simple, it only takes you a couple of days to pick it up. But it's like, there is a lot more that we expect of you when you write Go than just being able to write the syntax. So I think that's something that we kind of I think a manual style can really help with that, is like help people understand, like, yeah, you can pick up the syntax in like a weekend, but it's going to take you a very long time to sit down and understand all of the idioms that we have and why those idioms are there and how you use them and why you might want to violate them sometimes, and really understand the nuance of them. And I feel like a manual style can shorten that, right? It's the same thing with like Go Fumpt, where it's like, okay, well, I don't like how it does it this way, but it's like we as a community have decided that this is how we want Go Code to look and to feel. But there's other things like Go Lint where it's like, okay, well, maybe for this specific situation, we don't want to adhere to this rule. And there's ways of ignoring that rule in specific instances and specific circumstances. And I think we just kind of need more of that and need more of that explanation.
For sure.
I would say another thing is like picking the right time to sort of enforce or tell people about those style guide things. As an example, if I was going to start writing a book with O'Reilly or some other publisher at some point,
Is that a hint?
I doubt.
Is that a hint?
No, it's not actually.
Okay.
I haven't talked to O'Reilly, so. But like, I doubt the first thing they're going to do is send me their style guide and say, you need to follow this style guide. Like, instead, they're going to be like, give us a rough draft, an outline. Let's go through these steps first. And then at some point, we'll have to get the style guide involved and we'll understand why it's there. And they could even explain, we like this style to be consistent, because then the audience knows they can pick up a book and it's going to be in a similar style that they expect. And it really helps the reader. And I think it's the same in Go code a lot of the time. It's just, it helps people reading the code. That's the biggest benefit almost always. But like knowing that and knowing when to actually present those versus like somebody who's just learning the language, they've been programming for 2 weeks and they have a bug, or, they're figuring out, and then somebody jumps in and says, oh, this isn't idiomatic. It's like, is this really the time to be bringing this up right now? Like, now you're just making it a barrier for no reason.
And at that point, they might just be like, oh, I'll just try Python then.
And I think that's an interesting point too for something we're talking about earlier, which is like when and how we do code reviews. Because I think sometimes people do start to focus on like, oh, this isn't idiomatic at the code review, because that's basically the only tool we have in affecting what the style of the code base is. Like a lot of places, if you're like, the dreaded technical debt of like trying to get that scheduled, trying to go back and like clean up the code base and add consistency is just not something that we've built into our processes. So I think that we as a community, and then I think as a wider industry, need to understand, like, we can't just have one code review. We do have to sit down and periodic points, look at the whole, the whole of the code base and make sure that we have this consistent style, because that's just like maintenance. I kind of think of it, I had this analogy of like your kitchen. Like if you never clean anything in your kitchen until you need it, it's going to be a lot harder to clean things, and your kitchen is going to be absolutely disgusting. And then at some point, you're just going to like clean everything, and your kitchen will be beautiful, and you'll be so excited. But then if you don't keep cleaning things as you use them, you're just going to get back to that bad state. And I feel like that is exactly what we do with our software so much. It's like, oh man, we've done all of this so bad. Let's say cleaning our kitchen is like a rewrite. Instead of like just cleaning it, we like demolish the whole kitchen and build a new one every time. And it's expensive. Like, yeah, it's extremely expensive. And we just need to have better ways of like going in and being like, okay, no, you just have to like clean the pots and pans and the dishes, and it's like you can let them sit for a day or two, that'll be fine, but maybe you should like let them soak so it doesn't get all like really difficult to get the dehydrated food off of the pots and pans. But it's okay to leave things for some time, but we are going to come back and we are going to clean the kitchen. And we have to do that with our code base. We have to come back and we have to clean up our code bases. We have to just be good citizens and good maintainers.
Do you, I guess this has me thinking of when I first started working at Google. They have like two separate different reviews. One is like a code review and the other is like a style review. And until you get, I think they call it proficient, I don't know what it is, but there's some sort of style thing in any language you're going to write code in, that eventually you have to go through a separate review that sort of reviews the style for writing that code, like whatever language it is. So like to give you an example, the first couple like Java things I wrote basically had to be reviewed by one person who's reviewing the code for like correctness within the team. And then there's another person who has like Java. He's like an expert in Java is the best way to put it. So he's like a veteran. He knows what the style guide there is, and he can look at the code just for style stuff. And eventually you write a big enough piece of like code that you submit that is meant to sort of demonstrate your understanding of the style guide of Java. And from that point on, you don't need the style guide review, which I mean, somebody can still point something out in a code review, but it's like not necessary from that point on. And I'm kind of wondering if that approach might actually be better for some companies where you really help people understand your company style guide and the things that are important there. And then you sort of move on. I know at the time it's kind of frustrating to be like, I've got to go through both of these reviews, but you do learn a lot in the process of like how this company does it. And I'm even thinking of, I worked with one team that did Ruby, and Johnny, you'd mentioned you could tell who wrote what. But there was different ways to like iterate over a slice, or not a slice, I don't know, a list, I guess, in Ruby. But there's different ways to do that. And the team actually had me changing to the style that they used. And at the time it's kind of like, that's annoying to figure this out, like, and to adapt to their way. But now that I've like coded longer, it makes way more sense. I completely understand why they pushed for that. And I guess I'm just wondering if having that separate style guide review that's sort of baked into your process early on might be beneficial for some teams.
Yeah, I kind of feel like that's a bit like how when you have like when you're like writing a book, you have different types of editors, right? So you have like a story editor, and that person's there to like make sure your story is consistent and that it's accurate, and they do some fact checking. And then you have your copy editor, which is just the person that's like, is your sentence structure, or are you are you using the like words correctly? Like, do you have typos? And just like really making sure that you're more or less meeting a section of that manual style. And I think, yeah, absolutely, we should have more of those types of reviews, because just because you understand the space doesn't mean you understand the language that well. And I think it can be hard to, I think it's definitely harder, especially as companies scale, to like have everybody know everything. I think that's kind of impractical. And having a few people that specialize and are experts in something yields a lot of value, as we've been saying, in like the ability for everyone to read and to understand and contribute to the code bases. So yeah, I think you can really just take, some expert Go engineers and have them just be able to review all of the code reviews that come through and make sure, like, is this, Go style? Is this meeting the idioms that we have?
I also think it's easier come review time to like only focus on one thing. I know when you get a big chunk of code and it's like, I'm reviewing this for style and for correctness and like, these other three things, at some point you're like, it's hard to like cover that all in a review without going through it multiple times. But we are getting near the end of the episode, so I guess we have time for unpopular opinions. If anybody has any they'd like to share.
I will go. I will start a fight with Kris and say that I don't think you can afford to review the entire code base and clean up or at least I'm speaking from the point of view of the business here. No business wants to pay developers to make things pretty or make things and the words that we would use as engineers, right, more maintainable, easier to ship features and make things faster, et cetera, et cetera. while there is a case to be made for that, the business is going to see that as a cost, right? Because it's much easier to see the time engineers are spending in putting into something that it is really arbitrary, unless you're really good at tracking and you can tell exactly that, these improvements you made, last month to the code base led to a speed up of the shipping of this particular feature, right? Which is very, very hard to do. No business really wants to really wants you to do that, right? So I think, but what I will agree with, with your analogy, Kris, is that you should be cleaning, right, your pots and pans as you go. Never assume you're gonna get a kitchen makeover, right? To stick with that analogy, never assume you're gonna get a makeover. You can just blow away, the west wing of the house, and you get a new kitchen, right? You better keep, scrubbing your pans and keeping things tidy as you go, because chances are you're not gonna get to do it over again. It is way too costly for the business. At least in my experience, that's what I've seen.
Absolutely, let Kris rebut this. But as someone who is purely on the business side, as a product manager, I take issue with that blanket statement. We on the business side do care about that.
Ooh.
I would say we do have to weigh up like tech debt in conjunction with feature projects with other priorities, but it is definitely in the list of priorities, and it's definitely on our mind, because if I, as a product manager, go to my team and I say, okay, great, we need to build this, machine learning, personalized push mechanism. And then they come back and they say, I don't even know where we built that. There's this, we have these 3 repos that are, these 3 microservices that are all linked together and they're reliant on each other. And we'd have to decouple those and build this and blah, blah, blah. I just want a clean architecture that we can build great features on top of. And part of that is me as a product manager, like fighting against the other business partners to find time to say, no, we're not going to develop this feature. Our engineers need to do this cleanup. Agreed, you're not going to be ever in a position, I doubt, where someone like me will come to you and say, hi, you have 5 months to rewrite your entire code base and make it beautiful. But it's about bringing in those opportunities, and hopefully, if you have a big enough team, concurrently allowing your engineers to take on tech debt as well as pushing forward features and giving them kind of best of both worlds. That is what I strive to do. It's very difficult, but I would say blanket statement that we on the business side don't care, I take issue with. I pass the baton to Kris.
Hey, you asked for Unpopular.
I guess I would say that I don't. I agree with you on one point. I don't think that we can afford the time to like stop and like have an 8-month review of the whole code base and make sure everything's like spick and span and shiny. Like, I don't think that's good. I think the thing that we want to do is over time do. So it's like over time, we've basically rewritten the whole code base every year, but we don't have any point in time where like we stop doing everything and rewrite the whole thing. I guess it's sort of like, I would use an analogy of like rearranging your kitchen over time. And sometimes you're just like, okay, this cabinet is really messy, and you're not going to demo your whole kitchen and build a new kitchen just because one cabinet is messy. But you're like, okay, I'm going to focus on this cabinet and really think about how I use the things in it and arrange it so it's good. And then I'm going to do that periodically for all of the cabinets in my kitchen, just to make sure that things are where I use them and they're in a good space for me if I'm doing a lot of cooking, right? You probably don't need to do that if you're not doing a lot of cooking, but if you're doing a lot of cooking, like having things that you need really nearby can actually speed up the process a lot. So I think that there is this big value proposition in this, having cleanlier code bases, that you can just start adding in features much more quickly as long as you make sure you're continually keeping your code base clean and keeping it consistent. So I guess I do agree with you on the like, no, we can't just stop and rewrite the code base for 5 months. Although I will say that is actually what tends to happen a lot at companies, right? The code base gets so bad that we declare it legacy, and then we say we're just going to go build the whole thing again. So like, your unpopular opinion is actually what we tend to do at a lot of companies.
His unpopular opinion is definitely what, like if somebody graduates college and learns all these things and then goes to a company I feel like it's new grads that very consistently are like, all this code doesn't follow standards and doesn't follow these rules. We need to just get rid of it and rewrite it. And I think a lot of that's that naivety that like you can just stop and rewrite everything. But I do think, like you are right, Kris, you can definitely remodel your kitchen piece by piece. The biggest downside to that is that you have to do it within the constraints that are there. The best example I can give is like let's say you have a refrigerator that's giving you issues and you need to swap it out. You don't renovate the entire kitchen for that, but you do have to get a fridge that fits in the space you have. You can't just go buy this massive fridge that would solve all your problems because you want to, because you've got a limited space in your kitchen. So I think like that same analogy works where teams need to be refactoring things and iterating on them as they go, but they need to sort of keep it within the scope of what's reasonable for the project. You can't always write it the way you would if you were working from scratch, but you can definitely improve on what's there.
So I don't think y'all have been part of a kitchen remodel because because you can't take out like just like if I
you
tell
can
my
replace
wife,
appliances.
if I tell my wife, look, we're gonna redo the kitchen, we're gonna take a modular approach, a very very sensible, responsible approach. I'm just gonna take this row of cabinets and we're just gonna swap out just this row, right? We're gonna leave the bottom row. I know it's gonna look a little rough for a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months. Who knows? I mean, we're taking being responsible here, because we want to ship feature, we want to make food faster or whatever, right? So that's not gonna fly, right? So some jobs, you if you're gonna replace the cabinets, you have to replace all of the cabinets because you're gonna bring people in to do that labor, taking out the old, putting in the new, right? So the analogy here being that some parts of your code base, and I think we, to some degree, we've all been a part of these projects whereby somebody goes and says, well, you know what, we should really take out this whole module, this whole component. We should just rip that one out. And then you go in there and you realize, oh, well, crap, that one is tied to that component. So if we remove that one, that we need to refactor, this dependency here, which is going to cause this one to change, and that's going to affect that one and that one and that one. All of a sudden, let me just refactor or remove or recreate this one thing turns into a much larger project than you anticipated, right? So that, leaving folks like Angelica to have to fight with the business, right, to get that team the time that they need to actually do this surgical work, right? So, which is why I think you tend to see less and less sort of a appetite, I should say, right, from the business to let these things fly. It ends up having to be a fight every time.
Goes back to the original around needing to have a clear plan before you start coding.
Right. Nice.
Let's plan it out. Let's do a tech brief, a RFC, a POC. Let's get all our ducks in a row before we start building it.
And to clarify a little bit, when I was talking about the cabinets, I was talking about the things in the cabinets, not the cabinets themselves. So rearranging like all of your spices and whatnot so that they're easily accessible. Because a piecemeal replacement of cabinets, no. Why would you
can do partial things though? Like to give you an example, Johnny, my brother recently painted all of his cabinets and it looks 100 times better. Yeah. And that's not a complete he's not completely renovating, but he did do something small.
Lipstick on a pig. Yeah, I get it.
And you can take appliances out and swap those. But I mean, like even going to your point, sometimes when you say we're going to do all the cabinets at once, the reason you do that is because you analyze like the pros and cons of doing it all at once versus piecemeal, and you realize that cost-wise, it's going to be way more effective to do it all at once. And I think with software, it's the same thing. You kind of need to figure out what's the most effective route forward, or like, can we repaint these and get by for another 5 years and see how it goes? And that's kind of the cleaning up. And still in my mind, that's cleaning up. It's not forcing a complete rewrite of something. It's just deciding what's going to get us by.
I think the moral of this is that there's a lot of nuance in these things. And we have to apply liberal amounts of nuance to kind of like anything that we try to analogize or add in general.
Business side does care.
I mean, I feel like half of this episode is now about kitchens.
I will say I have never run into a product manager that has ever said, no, you're not allowed to play down technical debt, or you're not allowed to make the code base look better. It's always, all right, like, how much time do you need? What do you think the velocity of the features we're going to get after it? Do you think we can still build features while we're doing it? I've never had anybody just be like, no, you can't. We don't have time to clean up the code. So I think everybody does know on some level that I think they've all had an experience that like, oh, if we don't clean up this code, then it's going to take 10 times longer for me to get a single easy basic feature, and it is going to suck. And I'm going to have to explain to the business why a 2-week project is taking 2.5 years to complete.
And you can always refactor as you go. Like, you don't even have to get permission in a lot of cases. It's just if you're touching some code and the code around it could use a cleanup, you can sometimes get away with it.
Yeah.
But, well, I can, but I don't have a boss yelling at me, so maybe I'm different.
I am very
Maybe it's
happy.
been too long.
If anybody has a
comes to
boss
me-
yelling at them, they need to change that situation.
Yeah.
That's all
If
I'm
any
like.
engineer
Psychological
comes to
safety.
me and does like a small change, and they're like, "Oh, while I was doing the small change, I put the unit tests in and I did some cleanup." I'm like, "Thank you, you're wonderful. Please continue."
I mean,
I
Johnny,
see.
didn't you know that's what pair programming with Matt is like? He just yells at you the whole time.
Oh,
Just
no.
getting yelled at.
No, I'm just kidding. I have no idea, but I'll try it and let you know if that's what he does.
Management by screaming is not the type of environment most of us want to work in.
All right. Well, I think we're over on time. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We hope this has been enlightening and helpful, and hopefully you'll take some time to learn about writing. I guess as we're signing off, Kris, Angelica, Johnny, do any of you have any recommendations on what people can look up to learn more about writing? Any books or anything you recommend that might apply here or help them in their coding world? Didn't mean to put you on the spot.
I mean, honestly, if you're interested in the concept of kind of coding is writing, and it's a way of communicating your thoughts and feelings and communicating what you're trying to do to other people, if you're interested in that concept, I would recommend that you watch Laura Borowski's YouTube talk. She did a TED talk on how language shapes the way we think and kind of cognitive diversity when you're using different languages. I think code does kind of come into this, and how it's interesting that languages at their root are all very similar. They have the same baseline, but then the way in which you communicate to others tells a lot about yourself and the way in which you think about solving problems. So I think it's interesting. It's tangential to a lot of the points we've made here, but I think it's a good talk. Check it out.
If I can pitch something I did a talk at GopherCon in 2019 called the Gopher's Manual of Style that hits on a lot of these same points and kind of extrapolates on them and goes in a little bit of a different direction. It's on YouTube.
Scratch that. Just watch Kris's talk.
We'll have links in the show notes, so if you go to the changelog website, you'll be able to get those.
My recommendation is, since this is a Go podcast and we want to tie it, today's topic to Go, I'd say if you haven't read Effective Go, read Effective Go. It's one of the things I tell people, like, that I read once a year, and this and reading, right, the sort of how the creators of the language sort of intended for it to be used. You're going to pick up a lot of how to communicate intent, right, in your code, by reading that manual. And also there is a we'll put in the show notes, but there is a something that the Go team had put together, a style guide. We'll put that in the show notes, for basically the do's and don'ts, right, for, like, I think it was code review comments. If you search up Golang code review comments, you'll find it. That's also is a very good sort of a piece of documentation to read, right, in order to help you with the writing. But the thing is about writing, it's one of those skills, just like coding, right? It's just something that you're gonna have to do. So write. If you don't have a blog, or if you don't have opportunities, right, to write at work, seek out those opportunities. If you don't have those at work, or it's not possible to get those at work, write a blog, right? Write what you're learning, how you're learning it, right? So again, get in the habit of writing for others to consume, not just for you, right? So, and again, you don't have to take people's sort of judgments of that. The internet is not always friendly. You might have people say, well, I hate that, and that's fine too, but you're not doing it really for them. You're doing it you're making your work public, but really this is for helping you, right? So this is going to require a bit of sort of stepping out of your comfort zone here a little bit. And before you call me out and says, well, Johnny, where's your blog? I don't blog. I do a ton of writing for either for my job or for writing for training courses or whatever it is. So I'm getting my writing kicks, in other places. So, don't call me out on that. But, again, just basically, find an opportunity to get some writing experience. Basically, I guess that's the bottom line. Do it, and then hopefully it gets better over time.
I would add a small thing to that too. I think a good way to kind of jump into writing more, that is a little bit of a less of a kind of jump as blogging is to do journaling. I think just like getting yourself in the habit of taking your thoughts and transforming them into words and seeing how that feels and kind of get a feeling for that is a really great way to start like becoming a better writer. I think it was, who was it? Richard Feynman, I think, had that quote about how, a reporter was like, it's so nice that you've documented your thoughts like this. And he's like, no, this writing, these are my thoughts. And he's like, I think through writing. And I think I feel very similarly about that. Like when I'm writing, it's not like I think and then I write. It's like I write by thinking. And I think that's a very effective way to become a better writer. Because I think a big part of it is just doing the craft. If you want to be a writer, start writing.
That's the trick.
Just end the show right there.
Boom.
All right. You guys can all stop recording if you want. We are still live, just so you know.
I won't start cussing then.
Like immediately after the show starts dropping
away.
F-bombs.
Yeah, you thought I was so sweet.
What I really meant to say is F this.
We get to see what a real managing style is like.
My real managing style is very nice. Thank you very much.
What do you mean you want to refactor? F and do it then.
Just do it. Why asking me? Just write unit tests.
She's like, I never tell them no. I just scream at them until it's done.
No, I just look at them and purse my lips. I just go, what do you think the answer to that question is? My team's going to kill me.
I mean, they do know you're going to be doing this regularly, right?
Oh, no. I'm a secret gopher. They know nothing.
Jon Snow.
All right. Johnny, you mentioned sequencediagrams.com and something else earlier on. Do you remember what that other one was?
Yeah, it was actually it was websequencediagrams.com.
Okay.
And I mentioned draw.io, which I think had a rebranding or something. It's a different URL now, but it'll forward. And then what was it? README driven development. Which I'm sure there's. Okay. I think that's just a thing. I'm sure.
I've heard the theme. I just didn't know if there's some specific resource you wanted to.
No, I'm sure if
Kris,
someone Googles, they'll find something.
Do you have a link to your talk?
Yes.
See, I've been jotting these down as we go. All right. You guys don't have to hang out here if you want to, but by all means, you're welcome. I'm not trying to scare people off, but we are over time, so just letting you know.
I added my talk link to the
cool. Thanks.
The doc.
Did you know we still have people watching the show?
Still
Hi,
do.
people watching the show. Thank you for watching the show.
Thank you for sticking around.
Seeing 8 concurrent right now. I think the most was 17 on YouTube, at least.
Right, and then we started talking about the kitchens and
and they all left.
I'm honestly, this was not the way I thought this was going to go, but I'm very happy about the direction it took.
Some of these are always interesting because you'll write the show notes and then somehow the episode will go a different direction and you're just like, you know what, this is a pretty interesting topic. Let's just keep going with it.
Yeah.
It's kind of challenging sometimes.
It's great.
As I said, I feel like we could have a whole podcast on this topic. Like, yeah. I have so much more that I want to say that I didn't get to say.
Well, keep it in your brain and let's chat about it.
there's just like I think one of the things that I like didn't bring up that I kind of wish I had was like one of the things we learned in I think it kind of goes to something you were saying earlier, Johnny. One of the things I learned in like my early creative writing classes was about how to give and take constructive criticism and separating you from your work and understanding that you are not your work and your work is not you. So like criticisms of your work help improve you, and you shouldn't see them as slights against you as a human. And I think that's something that like a lot of software engineers could use a lesson in. And then also like how to give proper constructive criticism, because I think that's really hard for people to do. I've gotten so much criticism that I'm just like, this is not how this is supposed to go. Like I have a literal degree in this. This is not how this like works. Like do better, please.
A lot of times it's, I don't know, it helps if you on the other side of it just assume that people are trying to, like they're not being negative or trying to be mean in any way. Like granted, sometimes people abuse that, but I found that like when I read something and if you like assume that the other person completely knows what they're doing, it's really hard to not take it really poorly. But if you just assume, well, maybe they don't know English that well, or maybe something else is going on, they just don't quite get how to express this, that more often than not, that tends to be the case. Like they're not trying to be mean. It's just, like you said, they don't know how to express it clearly.
Yeah.
But it's definitely very hard to do because like your knee-jerk reaction is just to be like, I'm going to reply and start cussing this person out for being like, you just don't want to deal with it.
Yeah, I mean that's something I talked about in my GopherCon talk this year. Was just about like being curious and always approaching like when you do get comments from people, being like trying to, I guess more or less give them the benefit of the doubt and being like, oh, okay, where are we coming from? And then once like obviously if they show that they're like just being a jerk, then you're like, okay, well, no, goodbye. Like I don't need to listen to you. But I think a lot of the time people aren't like coming for you unless you're on Hacker News then. But most of the time people aren't like coming for you to like like try and inflict harm. They're just trying to like give you some feedback, and as you said, they might not be the best at expressing it.
Sure. The amount of discussions I've had to mitigate between two engineers who have had like this very heated comment on PR discussion, and then they're very angry with one another, and then you get in a room and they're like, oh,
spaces no tabs, spaces no tabs.
I remember one instance where it was literally around how one of the engineers was naming their functions and how one of the engineers thought the others was too long, like their function names were too long. That was the whole discussion, and it took like 3 meetings to mitigate the issue.
Manuals of style. This is why we need manuals of style.
Which goes back to Chris's point. We need that style, because had there been that, then I could have just been like, boom, this is it. End of discussion. Like
this is why I feel like the Chicago manual of style is like literally like. I have a copy of it around here somewhere. Yeah. Yes, I don't know where. Oh, here it is.
This is the joy of coding by yourself sometimes, is that the style is whatever I decide it is that day.
Like this,
and then future me.
Oh, this is how thick the Chicago manual of style is. It's like literally 1,000 pages. And it's like, this is how you go about writing. It's actually more than 1,000 pages. And it's like, writer, and this is like one style, right? Like some people, like the AP style is very different than this style. And this is like only for a subset of the types of things you can write. Like there's different style manuals for like different types of writing. And it's all to get around a lot of this stuff. Like I think like the kind of classic example I come up with, but it's like, oh, what might be in it? It's like, do you put the punctuation inside the quotes or outside the quotes? And that is a contentious thing in a lot of writing circles.
And do you know I specifically try to restructure my sentences so I don't have to make that decision?
I do that a lot too.
Like, cause I'm like, cause to me, like visually, I'm like, no, that the period is not part of the quote. The period, I'm ending my sentence. I don't want to include the period in the quote. It bothers my mental.
It gets real fun when the quote is a question, but your sentence is not. So then you have like question mark, quotation, period, and
Yeah.
This is why I just do whatever I want, and I'm like, I don't care. It doesn't
I
matter.
think what usually matters is like if you pick a way, just stay with that. Just be consistent is what matters.
Yeah. I mean, I found like Johnny said, I'll do something similar in my own writing style. And like there's even like more recent ones. Like if you're putting like a smiley face and then have it's in parentheses, it's like, do you double parenthesis or do you put a space there? Like there's weird things like that come up
Or
that
you
people are like,
dot,
I gotta
dot.
change my code or my writing now. Like that's like the current generation's version of the punctuation inside of quotations is how do I do my emojis inside of these parentheses?
And then you need real emojis, not
Yeah.
character.
Well, now we've got real emojis, but that doesn't always work.
Another fun book.
Nice. So we're getting all of the book recommendations.
So you know how like Go's spec is like it's like a nice page. This book is the specification. This book is the specification for the English language. Like
not the Cambridge one?
Wow.
Yeah. This is the Cambridge
See,
Cambridge grammar of the English language.
Oh.
That is like the first book I would have sold after finishing whatever class required it. I would have been like, nope,
Really?
we're done.
Oh no, I bought this because I actually want to read it. Like
You and I have different interests is how I'll put this.
Self-inflicting wounds, you like, huh?
Okay. I am a writer at my core. Like I seriously like the journaling I do. I'm now up to writing 3,000 words a day of journaling.
Wow.
Like every single day. And I've been journaling every day for however many years 1,420 something days is. So for a number of years. Yes. I'm committed to being a writer. It's like it's in my blood. It's like, yeah, now you're gonna sit down every day and you're gonna write, Kris. That's what you're going to do.
Right is right.
I mean, I understand that. I guess up until now, I have not been that motivated.
I feel like it's like I just finished reading this book called Peak. That's like, have you all heard of the like Malcolm Gladwell's famous like 10,000 hours rule?
Mhm.
So the people that did the research that he based that on, wrote a whole book basically saying why Malcolm Gladwell was wrong and that is a bad interpretation of their research. And it's all about deliberate practice and purposeful practice, which is like this very specific type of practice that like musicians and athletes and chess masters engage in. And one of the things that like is about it is like you spend a lot of time by yourself just like practicing that art and studying that art. Like if you want to become a chess grandmaster, you study other chess grandmasters games. Like you have to play chess, yes, but you have to spend even more time just like analyzing chess games that people have played. I think the same thing's true of writing, or it's true of like basically any discipline. But for writing, it's like you have to like study the language and study writing by other people if you want to be a good writer.
I mean, I don't agree with that. I guess what I mean is my style of like I write a good bit still. Just it tends to be technical content. And I'll try to read some of that, but like I for whatever reason I'd have a hard time sitting down with like either of the books you showed us and just reading them. I think right now at least it'd be hard for me to do that. But
Yeah,
I do read a lot, so I can't say I don't read. It's just it's not that.
I think that's kind of like the difference between like being someone like, there's lots of people that like play tennis, but there's only a few people that are like Serena Williams level of tennis. The same thing for like, anything, any subject you could pick. So yeah, you can like do things casually or even do things like somewhat professionally and then not be at that like I want to be an elite level human at this or whatever. So yeah, I don't think most people should read the Cambridge grammar of the English language. 2,000 pages of, and it's like you don't actually read the whole thing, right? Like the same. Yeah, because there's some parts that are just like, oh, these are words and how you're supposed to use them, and like that's kind of like reading the dictionary, which is like maybe if you want to make it like a habit so you can like broaden your vocabulary, that's a good thing to do. But if you're just like trying to grok the language more, then you don't really need to do that. In the same way that it's like, oh, you don't need to like go read the Go spec very often. But it's helpful to have there to go refer to if like you forgot how to do something or you're trying to figure out some tricky syntax. Like I recently started doing a lot of stuff with bit manipulation and the the Go spec has been very helpful in telling me what the different characters mean and what they do.
All right, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you all. I hope to do it very soon. I need to go tell some engineers that they can't address any tech debt for the next year. So I will. I'll
He's
go
getting on
do
that
that
quick.
now.
2 weeks in.
Yep, no tech debt this year. They've had their share of tech debt last
First
year.
2 weeks. It's like, that vacation time. That's when you're supposed
Yeah,
to.
That was it.
over.
That was-
All
You
features all the
missed it.
time now. It's lovely chatting. Have a great rest of your
Bye.
day.
All right, gang.
Yeah.
Have a good one. Bye.
Oh man.
All right, gang. I'm out. I've got to, go put out fires. That's our.
See you, Johnny.
Yeah.
Bye. Bye.
I really do want to turn this into like I like this topic. I want to talk about this topic more.
I mean, you could always write a blog.
I should write a blog. I'm actually like one of my projects. It's like the pinned tweet I've had up for 2 years now. It's about me trying to start a manual of style. So I'm trying to like actually make moves on that now, because like I think 2 years ago when I said it, it's like, oh, that's a nice thing, but I have like all of these other things that feel more important to do right now. But now that I'm kind of like in these circles with more prominent gophers, I'm like, oh no, this is something that we need. We've needed this for a long time. So
The other thing it can be useful with is like if you have like 30 minutes before a meeting and you don't want to start something that's going to take you more than 30 minutes to sort of get into. I found that just writing down some of that stuff is a good filler for those gaps when you have them. Like as an example, if I like, let's say it's 2:00 and I know we have go time at 3, like that hour, I'll be like, okay, I'm just going to sit down and write some article on some relatively small subject or something. And I found that if you just tackle it in like small bits like that, it can be easier to sort of start.
yeah, I mean,